Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Back to today, how we've harmed others. And it's slightly different today in that we look at it from an Islamic perspective first. The fact that shaitan is in shackles and that we are on our best behavior. That Ramadan is leaving is on ourselves. Reading from The Quest for Virtuous Character by Habib Muhammad. The section is called, what they're speaking about here is just to put it into context, right? When we'll all be held to account for our deeds, actively even in addiction, taxes, or checking in with our sponsor, or generally because our addictive behavior is sanction. And so one of the ways we know that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows on our shoulders, taking a record of the greater reality within which we live. There is a day of reckoning, and that they think about am I perhaps taking away from it to something, or am I watching this when my family watching this when in whatever. And I'm not trying to discourage you from watching action or what the consequences are. So in light, especially relative to acquittal, so the Prophet ﷺ said, on the day of judgment, but it, after the animals have settled their rights, they will turn but so here Allah is saying that, even if between two sheep one had horns raised up, even sheep, consider, horns will be given opportunity to butt. And when the scores are settled, because so often we think that, and especially in South Africa where crime is rife, yes, but here Allah is saying, when you think of nature, that it has a set of laws, and there's a food chain and that kind of thing. One sheep was oppressive towards another. The idea of it is like it's a little bit acted unjustly against another, or harmed opportunity to for justice, right? If this is the state of the sheep, then consider what of our state. Butting heads with another it doesn't really make that much of a an impact. It's a very different story. So salah, fasting, compulsory charity, which is your zakat, and hit this one, consume the wealth of this one, may have acted unjustly, but he all his zakah paid, and all his fasting complete, etc., etc. So he had, but is bankrupt. Why? Because he also committed. He ends up having all the of his own good in Qiyamul Layl, all the early mornings, the Nafil Salah, and even your Faraid, all of it. If his good deeds finish, and he himself is thrown into the fire. So, as good people, and we've left, doesn't necessarily mean that we've the score has been this hadith saying that even if you come with all of these good deeds, bad deeds they have, their scale now gets given to you. Held to account for deeds that you haven't even. You know what? Alhamdulillah, I've lived my entire life without being. Or I've never eaten haram or whatever, unfair in paying their. Whatever, right? For all of them, to give all of them, and you then have their zina or their intoxication shoulders. Whoever has perpetrated an act of injustice against the honor or from it immediately, there exists no gold or silver coin, no bank account that you have where you can say, okay, I see the error of my ways and I shouldn't have just overlooked it, let me pay. Paying back of justice, and if he has no good deed, he will acquire. Right? So it's just a reiteration, a slight variation on the hadith is coming to us, asking us of it because we owe it, or even if they do that, maybe they don't have a in our community where perhaps amongst, but then not repaid. Like, what's it to them? Like, why do I need of us asking them to wipe the debt? Because if someone wiped it, because the Prophet said that, consider for a moment that have a written contract to say, okay, and Amir, month, right? It's like, okay, cool, I'll pay you. It doesn't change the fact that it's owed, right? And I part of this is, on the day of Qiyamah, when and here that it's that on this day there'll be those who wish his wife, his brother, the tribe, or even to save ourselves, so much so that a call on that day. So this is clear agreements, written agreements, and even if earlier that perhaps the statute of limitation passes and that person for the debt, then let us pay, because greater than how am I going to eat at the end of the month, or how am I going to back this huge debt or whatever, what will my state be on the day of Qiyamah? Will this be in Ramadan when deeds are multiplied, like we all achieve or to find? I turn you towards step 8. And step 8 in the 12-step program says, we made a list of all persons we had harmed and became willing to make amends to them all. Right? So this part isn't yet making amends. Very often we want to jump the gun and we just hear, oh, I need to make amends, and someone pops into my mind and we think, okay, cool, let me go quickly, say sorry. Oh, don't do it. Don't do it. The process of making amends is one that needs to be understood. Part of why we often can't make amends properly is because we don't fully appreciate the extent of the damage that we've done. And so to say sorry doesn't make up for it, especially in light of the fact that our poor behavior may in fact be continuing. Right? So the book reads, with the 8th step, we begin to take responsibility for the harm we inflicted on others when we acted on our character defects. Most of us know that we caused harm in one way or another, but in the past, we chose to feel guilty without doing anything about it. It was frightening to consider the consequences of our wrongs, and we felt helpless to take action, or we were too self-absorbed to notice the wreckage in our wake, so wrapped up in our own resentments and hurts that we were unwilling to recognize our part of the problem, or our part of the problem. However, as we progress in recovery, we seek to reclaim the truth about our actions. Working steps 4 through 7 helps our responsibilities become clearer. In step 8, we claim both our integrity and our compassion and become willing to free ourselves from the guilt we have carried. I was watching a documentary called My Neighbor the Rapist, and it's about an area in Johannesburg, in South Africa, called Diepsloot. It's an informal settlement where rape there is just happening at like an alarming rate. In South Africa already, the statistic is something like, every 26 seconds a woman is raped. Right? Alarming, completely alarming. But a guy he lives in the area, and so he goes in and he makes this documentary, and you can find it on YouTube. And so he interviews various people, and one of the people that he interviews is a rapist, and he says that he's raped probably about 24 women, 21 to 24. And they ask him, do you regret it? And he says, no, I don't regret it. And I think about, and they says, have you considered, because they asked him afterwards, were you ever abused? And he says, yes, when he was 15, he was in jail, and the police officers used to rape him. And so, in a way, from a therapy or a psychological point of view, one could understand his current behavior, right? As a potentially a reclaiming of his power. But they asked him, think about how terribly you felt, and have you considered that your victims feel the exact same thing? So he says, I've considered it, and I realize that they probably do, but I choose not to think about it. So similarly, when we're in active addiction, we more often than not choose to not think about how we're hurting others. If you consider the addict that steals from his family, knowing how much they are in need of the money, or especially in poorer communities. I'll give you, in the wealthier communities, like jewelry and things go missing, items of value, and so it's like we know how attached our family are to certain possessions, but that's not enough, and so we'll take that, right? But in poorer communities, it gets so bad that you'll find addicts stealing even the plumbing in the house, and I'm not just talking about like the taps. I'm talking about even the pipes that run to the taps, especially if it's copper, because copper gets sold at the scrapyards, and you get a little bit of money for it, and that's really the only concern at that point, is how do I get 20 or 30 rand in order to get my next fix, right? Not who am I hurting, or what are the consequences, or I have now left my family without running water, or without a toilet that can flush, or without whatever. So we start by writing a list of all the persons we have harmed. Our fourth step inventory can be helpful in making this list, because when you consider your character defects, relative to that, you can consider, okay, who all have I subjected to that character defect, or who all's been affected by that character defect. Going back of our inventory, we'll see the names of many people we resented, feared, neglected, or harmed with our acting out. Most of these names will go on our 8th step list. Paying attention to the shortcomings outlined in the 4th step may also trigger memories of the harm we have caused to other people over the years because of these defects. The point is to make the list as complete as possible, trying not to leave anyone out. Whereas in step 4 we looked at our painful relationships to help us uncover our character defects, in step 8 we focus on the individuals affected by these defects in order to see how we have harmed each one. So the harms here, I'm reading from the Sex Addicts Anonymous book, because it goes into a fair amount of detail, and I mentioned this example of rape, and in South Africa, while rape is rampant, there are also lesser versions of sexual abuse, physical abuse, that kind of thing. And then there are even times in which our sexual activity have harmed others, even though it's consensual. So this just explains why the languaging in this next step. But you can substitute sex for literally anything else. You can substitute for any other addiction, shopping, gambling, overeating, whatever, right? So we may have harmed people sexually or physically, or hurt them verbally, or even just emotionally. Harm may have resulted from our actions or from what we failed to do. The degree of harm could vary from our being inconsiderate or neglectful to outright abuse. We list anyone we've harmed in any one of these ways. Many of us include details in our list, such as when we hurt the person, what we did to cause the harm, and what harm resulted. This is an important question because it's one thing to know who we hurt, but it's a whole other thing to appreciate the extent to which we've hurt them. Listing these specific details helps us to take responsibility for our actions in a concrete way. We found it helpful to start by considering the people who were directly harmed by our acting out behavior. We may have exploited and manipulated others, taking advantage of their vulnerability, convinced them to violate their values, or pressured them into various behavior. Some of us engaged in abuse and other harmful or illegal activities. We may have forced people to perform various things or to participate in our activity. We may have exploited children or used violence or threats to keep others from exposing our behavior. The important thing is to be thorough, including all people we can remember who were harmed by our behavior, whether we know their names or not. If we start to feel overwhelmed, we pray to our higher power and turn to our sponsor and friends in recovery for support and guidance. We also list those who have been harmed by our dishonesty, self-centered attitudes, or other behaviors that arose from our character defects. We may have lied or made false promises to people, even to those we felt closest to. And again, that comes in with the whole idea of the fact that we lead double lives in order to maintain our addiction. We may have been critical, impatient, argumentative, judgmental, financially irresponsible, vengeful, or mean. We also list people we've harmed by our neglect, by not showing up for our lives. Perhaps we were too busy for family or friends, missed important events, were preoccupied, withdrawn, isolated, or uninvolved in our work, or completely abandoned our family or loved ones. So while there's this joke, and it's sort of a local Cape Townian colored thing, where they say that everyone has an uncle who one day went to buy a pack of cigarettes and never came back. In the States, I think the joke goes that it's a carton of milk or whatever, but the idea is that a man just walks out and leaves his family, and we think of that as abandonment or neglect, not necessarily recognizing how we perpetrate a similar version of that behavior even when we're present, simply by being neglectful or unattentive. So we can sit with our kids in the room next to us, even on our laps, but we're too absorbed in our phone. And so we're just sitting, scrolling, Facebook, YouTube, reading the news, whatever, justifying the fact that maybe it's work, or maybe I need to, or maybe it's urgent, or whatever reason. But the reality is we're not present, right? And so there's a harm being perpetrated by what we're not doing, which is giving them the love and respect that they seek. We work this step most effectively when we keep our attention squarely on step 8, which is just making the list. So again, not taking action, but just making the list. Concentrating only on our willingness to make amends to those we have harmed, rather than worrying about how to actually make the amends, which is step 9. Right? The amends process is broken up into 2 steps for a reason, allowing us to take the time we need to become truly willing before moving forward. At this point, we only need to be honest with ourselves about the harm we've done. We stay focused on this work, letting go of any worries we have about the future. Our higher power is with us throughout this process. And so here, again, you don't need to involve anyone. You don't need to, go and call your ex and find out, hey, how have I harmed you, or whatever. It's this point. At this point, it's really just about being honest with yourself, and this can be, challenging in and of itself, because we may not want to, think about, oh, how did it feel when I stole from my mother? How did it feel when I shouted at my kids? How did it feel when I didn't show up to their concerts? Or how did it feel when I, tricked a friend into doing something for me that that like they really didn't want to? And so working this step means just increasing in willingness, constantly increasing in willingness. So yes, it feels terrible. Yes, I feel ashamed. Yes, I feel guilty. Or yes, I don't want to think about it. But by constantly focusing on the step, we increase in our willingness to confront that truth. Now, here's an interesting point. Many of us are surprised when it was suggested that we put our own name on our amends list. We forgot to take into account the harm we did to ourselves. In our addiction, we often took poor care of ourselves and acted in self-destructive ways. We may have betrayed our own values and damaged our sense of self-worth. Putting our own name on the list helps us to develop a sense of compassion for ourselves and encourages us to begin treating ourselves with care and respect. This is so super important. So important. Right? When we've completed our list, most of us ask our sponsor to go over it with us and provide feedback. So our sponsor may make suggestions for things that we've overlooked. So, for instance, putting our own names on the list. Some of us might not think about it, but our sponsor would. Right? They also may have the clarity of mind to remind us that there are certain things that we want to take responsibility for that actually isn't our fault, right? And that maybe we just want to take responsibility because we have an overwhelming need to take responsibility, or we feel a sense of just overwhelming guilt or generalized guilt, and so we think everything is our fault. And that's not healthy either, right? So working the step with someone helps us gain perspective without being too hard on ourselves. Now, after completing a list, we could feel justified in why we did what we did. Right? So let's say our thing is that we may have shouted something hurtful at our parents. Right? As an example. And we could say, it's because I was trying to tell them something really important and they just wouldn't hear it, and they kept fighting me, and it was completely unfair, and they realized afterwards it was unfair. And so, you know what, all things considered, it wasn't so bad. No, don't go there. As much as you're going to want to rationalize it, don't go there. Take responsibility for the harm, because whether or not someone else harms you doesn't give you the right to now perpetrate other harms, right? Right. In order to become willing, it's essential that we focus on our own behavior and not someone else's. This part may be small, but our part may be small, but we concentrate on that part. So a couple of days ago, I gave you the example of, what it means to stay on your side of the street, right? And this is exactly what this part of the chapter is talking about, right? It's just owning your part. So you may only have called someone a nickname, but that sets off a whole destructive pattern between the two of you, of which they don't necessarily, they didn't need to behave in such a destructive way. But you have to appreciate the fact that you threw the first stone, you called the nickname, and for that you are responsible. We find that when we hold on to grievances, old grievances, we are prevented from growing spiritually. In many cases, our list contains names of people with whom we have unfinished business. If our life is full of those unfinished conversations, our mind is filled with regrets and what-ifs. Working this step means finding the willingness to bring a resolution to those relationships, regardless of whether or not those involved behaved rightly towards us. The process to become willing to make amends involves a deeper surrender to our higher power's will than we have known before. Again, each step we're going, we're surrendering more and more to God's will. Some of us have felt trapped in our feelings about the past. We have felt great sorrow and grief over our actions and the losses that resulted from them. Sometimes we feel so ashamed that to talk of it further seemed almost unbearable. Like if you really did something that goes against your values, or that was really harmful, or in a moment of insanity did something that you just find so disgusting, then even to think about it, it's going to be painful, right? If we feel overwhelmed in this way, we turn to the God of our understanding, to Allah, and to our program friends for support in facing the pain of our actions and finding the willingness to make amends. Our lives are in God's care. No matter what harm we may have caused, we muster our courage in the faith that our willingness to continue with the step will both dramatically reduce our suffering and allow us to acknowledge the suffering we have caused to others. Empathy with those we have harmed is a sign of our willingness to make amends. This process cannot be rushed. We may never be able to fully understand what those we have harmed have gone through, but we can ask for the willingness to have this understanding given to us in God's time. Eventually, we find the willingness to proceed with the amends. However, we don't expect to work step 8 perfectly. Again, a lot of us have repressed memories, and so may not even realize just the full extent to how many people we've hurt, no matter how much time we spend on this, right? The memories may be triggered by, us just living our lives, So for instance, you're working step 8 and you've done whatever you need to do, and so you continue with step 9, whatever, and then you travel, and let's say you go and you realize that or you go back to a country that you visited before. So let's say you go to Morocco, right? And Morocco comes to mind because of how haggling is so customary. But sometimes, you perhaps take advantage of how desperate someone is to make a sale, and so haggle with them perhaps beyond the point that they would ordinarily go, or they'd willingly go, but you have the power because you have the money that they want, and so you take it too far, right? You may not have thought about that incident, other than that incident then came to mind later on when you were in a similar situation, or the same place, or perhaps you bump into the person, or whatever, right? And so step 8 is something that we can revisit. This isn't something that you do once and then it's done, right? Also, you may think that no, I need to do this properly, and so want to keep working it day after day, and you might want to go through every year from the year you were born and just think, what happened when I was 3 years old, and what happened when I was 5 and 6 and 7 and 8 and 9 and 10 and da, 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 da. And so you end up spending like endless amount of hours on it, and that's not advised either, right? So what they suggest is that if we're not feeling totally ready in every case, or if we feel still unsure about some names on our list, we can still move forward and not get stuck here. We can always return to step 8 and go deeper another time. Now that we've been honest about the harm we've caused and have become willing to do what we can to make amends, it's time to take action. Now we're ready to work step 9. So this last part basically suggests that as deeply as we want to go, there are still going to be instances where we're unsure. So especially when there are really complex family dynamics, and who really hurt who, and what was justified and what wasn't, and what can I do and what I can't, etc., etc. This can be like a really confusing, very overwhelming, And the idea is simply that if at the time we are unclear, that doesn't mean we can't continue to step 9. We can still go to step 9 and revisit that particular situation, right? So with this, we ask that Allah really open the doors of willingness, that He open the doors of willingness for us to know the wrongs that we've done, that really He grants us the understanding that it is in fact a gift, an insight into what might be on our books on the day of Qiyamah, and that through that willingness He also grants us the willingness and the courage to actually follow through in making amends. And tomorrow inshallah we'll discuss what the process of making amends is, and that Allah gives us the insight that we fully understand and appreciate the extent of the harms that we've done, and that He grants us the courage to accept these truths, as hard as they may be. And especially in these last few days, when we're begging Allah for His forgiveness, that with it Allah soften our hearts and cause us to be willing to ask those that we've harmed for forgiveness as well. We also ask Allah to soften our hearts to grant forgiveness to those who've harmed us in this very special time. So tomorrow inshallah we'll pick up on the process of actually making amends. And with that, I bid you farewell. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.